Greetings, sisters and brothers. This is Milton Alimadi. I'm making this commentary for African History Club. I haven't contributed to African History Club for quite some time. I believe this would be a very timely occasion because I'd like to comment on the recent elections in South Africa, the May 29, 2024 elections. So, in terms of most of the analysis that are out there, they focus on the election itself, the outcome of the election, the contemporary situation in South Africa. There's plenty of that. You can go to a podcast, you can look at any discussion on television in South Africa, you can read South African newspapers and international newspapers. But I want to take a different approach. I want to look at the election in South Africa in the context of where Africa, and of course South Africa, is located in the global capitalist economic system. So I want to put a historical context. And I think that allows us to better understand what is going on in South Africa, what is going on in other African countries, and what has happened historically. And my main contention is that while formal independence was significant historically for all of Africa, beginning with Ghana's, of course, when Ghana under Kwame Nkrumah won its independence from Britain on March the 6th, 1957. And of course, South Africa won its independence in 1994 when Nelson Mandela was elected president. All the previous administrations were basically illegitimate, although recognized by Western countries. You cannot have a legitimate administration when 80% of the population, the Africans, were disenfranchised. So South Africa, to me, its formal independence was in 1994. And this ended 3 centuries, of course, of European dominance, since Europeans established a beachhead in the Cape province, the Dutch and then the English as well. And it was much later, of course, in 1948 that Apartheid became the official racist segregation policy of South Africa. So essentially it was a pact between the Dutch and the English, who had fought each other many times, very bloody wars over who gets to control the riches of South Africa, the diamond, the gold, the land. They reached accommodation and said, it is best for us to work together to dominate the African population. So now let me go back to history and make my main point in terms of the difference between formal independence, independence on paper, and decolonization, which in fact is a process. So after Ghana's independence, Nkrumah, who was a Pan-African, who was a socialist, who actually many people may not be aware went to college here in the United States in the 1930s. He went to a historically black college, which was Lincoln University. And then after that, he went to the University of Pennsylvania. He went to London, and then after that, back to Ghana to help lead the liberation struggle against the British. So after independence, Nkrumah realized, and he said very famously, that the independence of Ghana was meaningless without the independence of all the other African countries and the formation of a United States of Africa. Nkrumah realized that the only way African countries could change their dominated and marginalized position in the global system was to use Africa's resources to industrialize, become manufacturing producers, and stop sending or selling raw materials, whether it's agricultural, whether it's natural resources or mineral resources, to the Western countries, who then put it through their factories, produce manufacturers, and sell it back to African countries at exponentially higher multiples relative to the price at which they acquired the so-called raw materials. So, of course, Nkrumah was targeted very quickly and early by the Western powers, who realized that if this kind of approach were to multiply in Africa, then of course Africa eventually could become a global power like China is today. Many people are unaware that in 1960, the per capita income of Ghana was almost double that of China. And of course, within the last few decades, China has now become a global power. It uses its resources, its technology, its manpower to develop China, whereas African countries are still in that dominated position, which was of course set up at the Berlin Conference in 1884, when Africa was formally partitioned by the European powers. So Nkrumah was targeted for elimination, and indeed he was overthrown in a coup supported by the Central Intelligence Agency in 1966. Much earlier, his protege, Patrice Lumumba, had been brutally murdered in Congo. And of course, Lumumba was being advised by Nkrumah. He was trying to change the economic structure after Congo won its independence from Belgium, trying to use Congo's resources for the benefit of the Congolese. And the Belgians, of course, were not willing to have that. And Lumumba was brutally murdered with the help of the United States. A very good book that documents this is White Malice by Susan Williams. It came out in 2022. If you haven't read that book, I strongly recommend. The subtitle is The CIA and the Covert Recolonization of Africa. Highly recommend that book. Okay, so, and then of course, who are the kind of Africans that the Western establishment supported? In the case of the Congo, Mobutu, who participated in the murder of of Patrice Lumumba. He was sustained in power by the United States and the CIA until 1997. So any African who had a vision of how to transform the continent and the marginalized and dependent position was targeted for elimination. Any African who was willing to serve as an enforcer of the status quo was sustained in power. And the best example being Mobutu, of course. We have many contemporary examples who are there today. General Yoweri Museveni in Uganda, who's also been sustained in power since 1986, and has multiple times intervened in the Democratic Republic of the Congo on behalf of imperialism, becoming the face of exploitation of Congo's resources. And then the West and the Western mouthpiece, the media, corporate media, spin those military interventions as so-called tribal wars, when in fact, basically, General Museveni loans the National Army of Uganda to act as mercenaries, sowing death and destruction in eastern Congo. And during this process of mass killings, at the same time, resources are being extracted. And of course, these minerals are not used in Uganda because Uganda is primarily an agricultural country. It's essentially an agricultural country, meaning all these resources are then exported to Europe or to North America. So that is the structure that is maintained in many African countries. And African countries are kept on leashes. They are made dependent on financing from the World Bank and the IMF. And obviously these institutions will never allow African countries to actually use their resources to industrialize and challenge the Western dominance. In other words, Africa will not be allowed to transform itself into a global power, a manufacturing power like China, and to compete with the West and to cut into the profits of the Western capitalist countries and their dominance. So let me make some distinction between African countries that did not have sizable European populations and the ones that did. So after Ghana's independence in 1957, in the 1960s, most African countries also won their formal independence. And I keep making the distinction between formal independence and actual decolonization. Of course, that's a significant difference. There were a few countries that it took much longer for them to become independent. Primarily the Portuguese colonies of Mozambique, Angola, Guinea, Bissau, and then of course Rhodesia and South Africa itself. So the Portuguese colonies did not win their independence until 1975. They had sizable European populations except for Guinea-Bissau. And of course, those did not want to let go of the economic dominance and the ownership and exploitation of the land and the labor of Africans that they were able to exercise. Kenya also had a sizable European population, and unlike Uganda and Tanzania, the neighboring East African countries, who both won their independence largely through nonviolent struggle, Kenya, it actually took a guerrilla insurgency, a guerrilla uprising by the Kenya Land and Freedom Army, which lasted from 1952 to around 1955, led by Dedan Kimathi, who ultimately was captured and executed by the British. But it set the momentum which led to Kenya's formal independence. And of course, Algeria, which also had a large European population, took the lesson from Kenya's struggle. And by the way, the British denigrated the Kenyan resistance as so-called Mau Mau. It's not even an African word. I think some British PR expert came up with the word Mau Mau, something that sounded like something you could relate to African savagery and witchcraft. So they were denigrated as Mau Mau, but they knew exactly what they wanted, and that's why they called themselves Kenya Land and Freedom Army. Algeria also, of course, fought a war of national liberation, and then in addition to other African countries that I just mentioned, Angola, Mozambique, Guinea-Bissau, Rhodesia, and South Africa itself. So let me make a few other points. The main factors that aided the liberation struggle in the African countries that had to fight guerrilla wars, it was training and arms from what was then the Soviet Union and the People's Republic of China. They helped the liberation armies in these African countries. Also, the African countries, after independence, they formed the Organization of African Unity in 1963. That, of course, was subsequently replaced by the African Union in 2001, 2002. But even though the Organization of African Unity did not really lead to the formation of the United States of Africa, they were able to do one thing, which has not been significantly discussed. They all contributed to the liberation of the African countries still dominated by Europeans particularly the countries I've mentioned already: Angola, Mozambique, Guinea-Bissau, Rhodesia, and South Africa. So they contributed training, money, and resources to what was called the Liberation Committee within the Organization of African Unity. They played a significant role. And some countries like Tanzania, Zambia, they hosted refugees from these countries that were dominated by European imperialism, and they also trained their guerrilla armies and provided sanctuary for the leaders of the guerrilla armies in those countries. And then finally, the contribution of Cuba. Because of the dominance of international news by Western corporate media, a lot of people are not actually aware of the significant contribution that Cuba made to the victory of these African countries over colonialism, and then sustaining that victory, and ultimately even leading to the independence of Namibia in 1990 and the release of Nelson Mandela in 1990 as well. And of course, then Mandela went on to become president in 1994. There's a very interesting documentary that discusses this. It's called Cuba, African Odyssey. And it's 2007, a documentary by Jihan El-Tahari. The last name is E-L-Tahari. I strongly recommend that documentary. Cuba is estimated may have lost up to 30,000 Cuban soldiers between 1960 and 1988 in its participation in the wars of national liberation in African countries. The most significant victory that the Cubans were involved in was the Battle of Quito Cuanaval, 1987 to 1988, where the Cubans, fighting alongside Angola's National Army, the ANC's armed wing, Umkhonto we Sizwe, as well as Namibia's freedom fighters called SWAPO, Southwest Africa People's Organizations. Southwest Africa was the name that South Africa had given to Namibia, which it had occupied for decades in defiance of United Nations resolutions, much in the same way that Israel continues to occupy the Palestinian territories. So after that victory at Quito Cuanaval, defeating the South African army, South Africa realized that they could actually lose on the battlefield to non-European forces. And it really shocked them and stunned them, because they'd been reared under this white supremacy mentality that non-Europeans could never defeat South Africa's European-dominated army with its very sophisticated weapons, many from the West and from Israel as well, with which it had, the Apartheid regime had a very tight military working relationship. So it woke them up. It led to South Africa's withdrawal from Namibia, and Namibia became independent. The release of Nelson Mandela, Mandela becoming president. All right, so now let's focus on South Africa. Part of the negotiation to release Mandela and for the multiracial elections to occur was that the status quo would essentially remain intact. And I personally have never faulted Nelson Mandela for that. I believe that after 27 years of incarceration, to me it did not make sense for Mandela to languish and eventually die in jail. I think the battle to transform South Africa and make it a real post-apartheid state belongs to the younger generation of South Africans. So Mandela becomes the president. Mandela serves for one term and then becomes like the elder statesman, seeing South Africa transition into Thabo Mbeki, becomes president, Jacob Zuma, and then of course today it's Cyril Ramaphosa. So, but here's one point. There's a very interesting short interview with Steve Biko And Biko was the leader of the Black consciousness movement in South Africa. I would compare him to a Stokely Carmichael, aka Kwame Ture, and Malcolm X, all rolled into one, Steve Biko. And I suggest you, if you're interested in finding out more, go on YouTube and watch that short interview. If you put Steve Biko interview, it will pop up on YouTube. It's about 24 minutes. And here's, to me, the most interesting thing that he says, amongst the many interesting things he says in that interview. If by changing and ending apartheid, if it involves, and I'm paraphrasing, if it involves only changing the color of the leadership, in other words, replacing Europeans with Africans, and nothing is done when it comes to transforming the economic system and redistributing the wealth, it would be as if nothing changed in South Africa. And sadly, that is where we are today in South Africa. The European South African population make up 7.3%, but own 72% of the arable agricultural land. Africans make up 80%, own 4% of the land. The remainder is owned by Indians, South Africans, and so-called colored, who are South Africans of mixed race ancestry. Unemployment, European South Africans, unemployment is 7.4%. Unemployment for Black South Africans, 37%. So essentially, structural apartheid remains intact. So now let's go to the election. The election of May the 29th. For the first time, the African National Congress won less than 50%, meaning it is obliged to form a coalition government. Here are the other parties that competed. The Democratic Alliance, the party of white privilege, led by European South Africans, won 21%, which is the same margin as from 5 years ago. MK, or Umkhonto we Sizwe, the party formed recently, a few months ago, by Jacob Zuma, the former president, won 15%. The Economic Freedom Fighters, led by Julius Malema, which is the party led by the South African youth, people in their 40s and 30s, which had won 10% in the last elections, slipped a little bit and won 9.5%. And of course, the Economic Freedom Fighters, the EFF, is the only party that had been demanding land reform and restoration of the land to the descendants of Africans whose ancestors from which the land was stolen during the European colonial ethnic cleansing beginning 3 centuries ago, and forcing the ANC to also start talking about land reform. And MK, the party of Jacob Zuma, is also demanding land reform. The DA, on the other hand, opposes land reform and opposes Black economic empowerment, which is meant to to promote a Black business ownership class. So which party has the ANC formed an alliance with? Well, if you haven't been following the news, I'm sure you can guess just by the tenure of my presentation. It's formed an alliance with the Democratic Alliance. It's formed a coalition government with the DA. And of course, this is what the interest of international finance capital wanted. Even before the elections, when it became clear the ANC would not win a majority, the New York Times, the Economist, all had similar commentary, editorials, or articles. You know, I mean, obviously they read each other. It's almost the quotes are verbatim. Both the Economist and the New York Times insisted that a coalition government between the ANC and the DA would, quote, be sensible and would please international investors. Forget the landless black South Africans. Forget the landless, jobless South Africans. So that is where things stand today. An alliance between the ANC and the DA. You could actually say that Steve Biko's prediction in terms of what would happen if ending apartheid meant only changing the color of the people in power has now come to fruition. This is a prediction that Biko made almost half a century ago. That is where South Africa stands today. And of course, Cyril Ramaphosa, the leader of the ANC, wants to remain as president. And he also probably would not have had a possibility of forming an alliance with Jacob Zuma's party. Jacob Zuma blames him for easing him out of the presidency. So had vowed that the only way he would form an alliance with the ANC is if the party kicked out Cyril Ramaphosa, which of course did not happen. And given the way that the EFF, Julius Malema's party, has been demonized in domestic and international media as somebody who represents a threat to South African stability, the ANC also was not willing to form an alliance with the EFF party. And they would still have needed to bring one of the other minor parties on board as well. So that is where South Africa stands today. Which way forward? I would like to discuss that in a follow-up commentary. So I would like to end today's commentary on that note. Steve Biko's prediction has now come to fruition. Structural apartheid remains intact. South Africa has not been able to move any further in terms of transforming its economy and setting an example to other African countries in terms of how formal independence can actually lead to effective decolonization, control over your economy, control over your resources, control over your production. I would like to end on one promising note, in that South Africa, by its intervention into International Court of Justice and filing the lawsuit against Israel, actually made some positive impact. I think that intervention encouraged many other countries around the world to become much more vocal in their criticism of the genocidal ongoing war on Gaza. So I want to give South Africa credit for that. But ultimately, actual apartheid, structural apartheid remains intact. The way forward, I'll discuss that in my next commentary. So thank you for listening. Please share this commentary with anybody else whom you believe would want to have a much more historical perspective and understanding of what is going on in South Africa and the rest of Africa. Thank you. See you soon. A luta continua.